Shalom, ladies and gentlemen, dear participant of the Herzliya conference. My name is Yariv Nornberg, and I am heading the representative office of the Swiss banking group Julius Baer here in Israel. Julius Baer is one of the leading financial groups specializing on wealth management, private banking, present in more than 50 locations around the world. Israel being one of our core markets, my colleagues and I are privileged to partnering with the Herzliya conference with the hope we can contribute to the discussion of the outlook of the global economy. Here with me today to tackle this challenge, two senior experts. Our bank chief economist, Mr. Janwillem Acket, Dutch and Swiss, and among others being an economist, also an alumnus of the Swiss Banking School and the IMD Lausanne. Also here with us is our head of research in Asia, Mr. Mark Matthews, a Canadian of nationality, so this is an opportunity for me, Mark, to congratulate you and all the Canadians, if there are some others here, and wish you a happy Canada Day. Mark is currently based in Singapore and lived in Asia most of his life, including in Hong Kong, Thailand, Taiwan, and Sri Lanka. Janwillem, allow me to start with you. You are a frequent visitor here in our country, and I remember you were with us here in the last US elections, when a new typecast of president raised, and with a new approach to world affairs. Since then, we have witnessed what is called by many as a trade war between the US and China, a confrontation that might come to an end following a cessez-le-feu, a ceasefire achieved last week at the G20 summit in Osaka. What's your view on that?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, trade war is a bit of an exaggerated expression. I would call it rather a trade dispute, because a war is a very ugly thing. A war would mean, across the board, tariffs. It would mean discrimination of quite a number of companies. It would be the disruption of value chains, so it would be a whole lot more than what we see currently. I think what we're witnessing here is the US with a new style of diplomacy, if we put it that way, trying to change something for the better, to go for fairness in trade. You see, this is something that is actually in the interest of Israel, but also in the interest of Europe. It's not only a US interest. And it all has to do with fair trade. It all has to do with the current facts that the Chinese are discriminating foreign competitors in their country. They are stealing know-how, and the methods that they implement are quite subtle because they actually follow the WTO rules to the point, but their non-tariff barriers are the big element that makes life for joint venture projects very difficult. Now, striving for fairness, I think, is a good goal. And the US is actually working and striving for something that the Chinese have actually been vowing to go for in 2012 already. But ever since, nothing happened. So we can understand the Trump administration, that they've got uneasy with all this, and that they're setting up different methods to coerce the Chinese to some sort of agreement for fairness. And I think that's a just cause. So you may perhaps criticize the style, but I think the cause is a just one, and therefore, as a European, I can only say, we in Europe, we have to profit most of it because we are more dependent of the Chinese and fair trade with them than the US. And I would say for Israel, it's also a good deal.
Mark, any seed to add from your side on the Asian perspective, more specifically China on that issue?
Yes, well, as you already, thank you for the kind introduction. As you already said, Yariv, I'm Canadian, so in case you haven't noticed, I'm not Chinese. But we have a lot of clients in China, and I get their feedback. And so I'll simply relay what I hear from our Chinese clients to the ladies and gentlemen in the audience, which is this time last year, China wanted a deal very badly. The economy was weak. In part, the psychological damage of the trade war, but mostly because they'd started a big deleveraging campaign to control their debt. And now the mood has changed because they've stopped deleveraging, they replaced it with stimulus, the economy is more stable. But also, last year, they controlled the social media very tightly when it came to this trade war. There was no criticism of the United States in the official state media. And now there's a lot of criticism of the United States in the state media. They're playing old Korean war movies on TV. They're letting people be very critical of the United States in the social media too. So what that's done is it's boosted nationalism, and it's helped Xi Jinping, the president. His power's gone up a lot in the party, Communist Party, in the armed forces, and among the people. They see him as a strong person who's standing up for the country. The coastal intelligentsia and the business people, they're not happy with the situation. They think he's been too aggressive with the United States, and he's been too flamboyant at home. But they're only about 20% of the population. 80% of the population actually like what's going on. They like that China's standing up for itself, and yeah.
Thank you. Back to you, Janwillem. We understand that you just framed that trade dispute has created a lot of uncertainty, אי-ודאות in Hebrew. This is not the only matter where we witness uncertainty. What does it mean for markets and the economy is concerned?
Well, markets are considerably concerned in this whole struggle for, equal trade conditions. I mean, it's also a clash of hegemons. We have the incumbent hegemon US, and then we have this, in many terms, seen as upstart hegemon China. But I would say, in a historical perspective, the Chinese are just going back to the role they already played during the times of Napoleon, when the US was actually just coming out of a British colony situation. So, in fact, China is going back to its just place in history. But it's a clash, it's a hegemonial clash. And because of the weight of the two players, the uncertainty is so significant that it is actually now coming at a very dangerous path of the cycle. Because the cycle in the US is this month now the longest cycle that we've seen since 1850. And the US cycle is determinant for the whole global cycle. It stands and falls with the US. So if the US is experiencing a mature cycle that rather tends to turn lower and to turn weaker, you can't have a lot of uncertainty coming onto the markets, because that is an element that is disturbing the Fed. The Fed has no domestic reasons actually to change policy, but the fact that you get disturbance in the markets, that financial conditions tighten, and that incentivize people to hold back, to become passive, that decisions are delayed, if that accumulates, then you get actually a slowdown, a drag on the cycle, which is then going to become serious. And the manufacturing sector globally is on the brink of a recession if you take it aggregated. Now, it's not always the case, depending on the countries you look at. We have a lot of divergence. We've got strong and weak countries. But to sum up, the trade issue is a drag on manufacturing. And when manufacturing collapses, it's just a matter of time that we will also see services, which are holding up well, weaken. So there's a lot at stake, and at the moment, I would say the global conditions are good, and we don't have a recession in sight in the next 12 months. But if the mood turns sour, and through the manufacturing, because of the trade disputes, we get stutterers coming into the system, then that will gradually spread also to the healthy economies, and then the divergence that we have is a dangerous phenomenon for the overall cycle. So it's that mechanism that has to be somehow stopped, and that can only be done with confidence-relaying measures, that we don't see any further degradation of the whole cycle into, let's say, 2020. That's the election year of the president in the United States, and you know that Trump wants to be re-elected.
Thank you, Mark. We all know this goes way beyond trade. When do you think, if at all, China will meet or surpass the US as a superpower, and what will it mean for the world?
Yariv, I actually happen to know you were going to ask that question, so I don't know if the ladies and gentlemen can see behind me this piece of paper that I'm holding up right now. Bank credit analyst based out of Montreal, my home country, Canada, run this geopolitical power index based on population, size of the economy, size of imports, military expenditure, arms exports, and energy consumption. So it looks like sometime around 2023, China, according to this particular index, will surpass the United States in power. I don't look at things like armies, I look at economies, and I can tell you now, China's a $13 trillion economy, the US is a $21 trillion economy. If China keeps growing at 6% per year, US grows at 2.5% per year, depending on where the renminbi is, somewhere between 2025 and 2030, China's economy should meet the United States in size. But where I would say I'm not so sure about that is I'm not so sure that China's economy is going to continue to grow at 6% per year. And the reason for that is simply if you look at the median age of the two countries, right now it's exactly the same. It's 38 years old. Average American's 38 years old, average Chinese is 38 years old. By 2033, the average American is going to be 41 years old. The average Chinese is going to be 47 years old, even older than the average American. In fact, by 2050, the average American will be 44 years old. The average Chinese will be 56 years old. They have a population time bomb on their hands because of the one-child policy. And so I actually don't think they will surpass the United States by 2030, but at some point in time, they will. And the bad news for the Chinese, I think, is more on the soft power side because it's a communist country. In fact, the party has exerted much more power over all aspects of society and the economy since the leadership transition in 2012. And that, I think, will make some countries think twice about deciding to be under the Chinese umbrella, particularly European countries. And the soft power, I think, is also a problem in China because the language is hard. English is easy, Chinese is hard. The identity of the country is very closely related to the ethnicity. So you can't just become Chinese, but you can just become American. I think they will become the largest power in the world. I don't know when, but I think that influence will remain very much in the Asian sphere.
Thank you. Back to Europe. We were initially planned to have the chairman of the Bank of England with us in the panel, and due to temporary health concern, he could not fly and join us. So Janwillem, I turn actually back to the questions addressed to him, to you. Are the Brits going to leave the European Union by the 31st of October?
Well, that's the plan, and those who followed now what's going on in the Tory party and the Conservative Party should actually be worried because the favorite for the new Prime Minister role, Boris Johnson, is actually at the moment advocating a departure of Britain even without a deal. So, a hard Brexit without a deal is something that he would not care of going for, but whether he will be able to get that through Parliament is going to be really doubtful. Why? Because you see, we've seen British Parliament argue for months and months and months and turn down 4 times Mrs. May's deal with the EU. There's only one consensus that they actually achieved in all those months, and the consensus was Britain will only leave the EU with a soft Brexit mode, that means with a deal. So that is really in contrast to what we've heard lately coming out of Boris Johnson's mouth. He likes to go for a renegotiation, but as you know, the EU is full of its own problems. They're actually fed up to deal with the Brexit at every summit. Currently, the EU has to define who is going to be in the 5 top jobs. I mean, we're talking about not only the Commission President, we're talking about the Council President, we're talking about the new President of the European Central Bank, the High Commissioner for the Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Mogherini, has to be replaced. And of course, I think the easiest one is going to be the President of the European Parliament. Parliament will go into session this week. So there's a lot that has to be done with regard to leadership. So imagine, 31st of October, if they don't make up the decisions correctly, and it's a horse trading exercise currently happening in Brussels, if they don't have these people in place, we might have the old guys still sitting on while the Brits, God forbid, go through the exercise of perhaps a no-deal hard Brexit. So you can imagine we might have a tight autumn situation. So uncertainty is not only hampering the markets and decision makers from the trade front, but also if you look at the European theatre, we have this Brexit thing. And don't forget, apart from the leadership issue, we have, next to that, we have something that will come back again this fall, and that's Italy with its budget. I mean, Italy is the most heavily indebted Eurozone economy, a large economy, a founding member of the EU. It's not a Greece. Greece is economically spoken, and I hope no Greeks are going to be offended if I say that, rather an appendix to Europe. But if you look at Italy, Italy is a heavyweight, and with a debt of more than 3,750 billion, which is now penalized with an add-on of roughly 2.5%. That's a very, very expensive chunk of debt that they have to carry along. And that's going to be something that has to that has to be solved somehow constructively going forward. So we have quite a lot of time bombs within Europe, and Europe will, by those circumstances, rather be a sluggish economy and continue sluggishly in contrast to the US, where we are rather optimistic, even though it could slow down, or even a China with its slowdown will be a multiple of European growth. And don't forget, if we talk about 1% in Europe, you and Israel are going to grow threefold, 3%, and that's great. So you can be proud of yourself.
Thank you. Mark, the Brexit debate might trigger a decline of London as the world's main financial hub. Would this create an opportunity for cities such as Singapore or Hong Kong, in your view? And who could lead instead?
I live in Singapore. I'm sad to say that it's really fallen behind as a financial center, apart from in private banking. It's not a big financial center. Hong Kong is big. The stock market capitalization is about $6 trillion. The UK, just to put it in perspective, is about 3.5, so it's much bigger than the UK now. And Hong Kong is going to merge with Shenzhen and half a dozen other big cities in the Pearl River Delta to make what they call the Greater Bay Area. It's going to be the largest city in the world, over 70 million people. And I think you might have seen on television there were big protests in Hong Kong 2 weeks ago, but the government backed down, which they must have gotten the tacit permission from Beijing to do. Shows you that Beijing doesn't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. So I'm bullish on Hong Kong, but that doesn't mean that I think Hong Kong will replace London. And the simple reason for that is when it's 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. in London, it's 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. in New York. So they can cross and work together in the same working hours. In Hong Kong, that would be 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. in the morning when the Americans are working. So Hong Kong and Singapore, we're on the opposite side of the world. And for that simple reason alone, I think London will remain London.
Another question to you, Mark. India and China both opened up in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. Today, China GDP, you mentioned that before, is about $13 trillion. While that of India is only 2.6 trillion.
Yeah.
Where do the difference lay?
So I think I can count 3 reasons. The first is the legacy of Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi, who, because of them, modern India has been very wary of free trade and globalization. So India has this endemic, I don't know what you call it, isolationist tendency. The second thing is their agricultural sector is inefficient. There's too many people, not enough food, lack of infrastructure. Mafias hoard grains and vegetables in India to make a profit off of price fluctuations. So according to the United Nations, about 40% of the food in India is wasted. It just goes rotten in storage. And anyway, why I'm telling you that is because there's not enough surplus food, they can't create big urban populations. And you need a big urban population to have a manufacturing sector, and then you have a manufacturing sector, you can do what China did. So the urban population in India is 30%, in China it's over 50%. The last thing I would say is that So they never develop manufacturing the way they should have. But the last thing is they have a massive and complex bureaucracy. So just getting a permit to build a building, to start a business, it was near impossible before Modi. So many pieces of red tape you had to jump through, and there were different tax regimes in every state, which made it very difficult for any business to do business on a pan-India level. So all I will say, to end on a happy note, is that since Prime Minister Modi has gotten a lot better, and he has just run a second term. So I think it looks good.
Thank you. We're actually close to end our panel. So tell me, gentlemen, the markets signaling right now that the stock markets are at the heights with a lot of optimism. On the other hand, the US Treasury is around 2%, and US big houses are currently forecasting 1.75% of the 10 years Treasury yields for the end of this year. Inflation expectations are even lower than that. And are we in for a significant cooling of the global economy and face danger for yet another recession, Janwillem?
Well, as I said, I'm an optimist, and I believe the mood is probably worse than the current situation actually justifies. I already mentioned that, we don't see a recession in the next 12 months. And if you think about the central banks, I mean, we have one major central bank, the Fed, that is now being coerced into rate cuts. And in fact, it has no motivation to do that because employment is high in the US, 104 months in a row of job creation, a record. We have a 50-year low of unemployment in the US. We have actually seen the last 4 years no real inflation. So it's the best of worlds, and why should the Fed change policy? Well, as I mentioned, we have these financial conditions, we have the worries, and I think the Fed is just trying to go and soothe those worries, and we expect a so-called insurance rate cut on the 31st of July. So we'll have some soothing influence of the Fed, but I don't think that the Fed will go aggressively in rate cuts as the market expects it, because you see, you can be caught out suddenly with an inflation surprise, and then you look bad as a central bank. And a central bank should never be the hostage of the markets. So I think the markets are overdoing it in their expectation with regard to the US. I think the view on the bond markets are just too gloomy, even though big houses are forecasting the 175 at this year end. If you look at elsewhere, depending on the diverging situation, we have in Norway recently seen a rate hike because the economy is doing quite well. And on the other hand, relatively close to that in the region, we see the ECB in Frankfurt that is even announcing more lavish policies. There's even discussion of further negative interest rates, which I think is bad because that hacks into the profits of banks, but I'll just leave it there. We have, from the central bank side, rather an alleviation of the situation to expect and not some restriction that could create more tension in the market. So the central banks will be helpful. We can only hope that politics will be helpful, and that the fact that Trump wants to be re-elected and he's now with his new slogan out, "Keep America Great," it shows that this man wants to go on after 2020, the next 4 years onward, that he will do everything to keep the markets happy, because the markets are, in fact, reflected in the stock holdings of his voters. And on the other hand, I think it's also in the self-interest of the Chinese that in the end they arrive to some sort of agreements with the US. So by that, I'm actually optimistic, and I believe that we will not see anything from the US administration that would significantly harm the re-election chances of the president. So be that as it may, we should nevertheless be probably expecting for 2021 a difficult year, even though 2020, one could say they could just save themselves in the positive for this re-election. It's going to be a tricky thing because the cycle is already mature and long, and I think it's very important that the markets are patient also with the Fed and don't push the Fed too far and that it gets caught out, because imagine a Fed that would have to break the party, would have to crash the party in a situation, let's say 2020, when we suddenly have an inflation surprise because of the good economic conditions in the domestic US economy, and at the same time the overall cycle shows a weakening tendency. If you are in a stagflation situation, and as a central bank you must react for credibility reasons, well, you crash the party. And unfortunately, if you look back in history of the Fed, that was the case. So I'm not pessimistic for this year, for the next 12 months. I'm cautious until year-end 2020, but I'm really wary of 2021 if it works out the way as it looks in our models.
Thank you, Janwillem, for making us optimistic. Last but not least, as we still have some time, Israel. How is it seen from Europe and Asia at the respective places where you live and work? Mark?
I guess I'll make 2 points. The first is, if you consider Australia part of Asia, I don't know if you do, but there's 100,000 Jewish people in Australia. 5 of the 7 wealthiest Australians are of Jewish origin. So there's a very healthy and strong interest in Israel from Australia. I think the Chinese think the Jewish people might be the only race smarter than them. So they also have a lot of respect for Jewish people. That's a good thing. Otherwise, I have to be honest, they don't really seem to pay much attention to Israel. Even Israeli foreign policy or the disputes with the Palestinians, you never hear anybody in Asia commenting about that. I think they are aware of Israel as a technology hub, and that's where it could be interesting because their focus has been almost exclusively on Silicon Valley. And I'm sure you know that China's put many billions of dollars into Silicon Valley. So if they are ostracized from Silicon Valley, intuitively it would make sense they would look for other places, including here.
And Willem, anything to add from Europe?
Well, I can keep it short and punchy. For me, Israel is the superpower of gray cells. And every time I come here, I'm all the time astonished about, first of all, the skyline of Tel Aviv is changing constantly. There's a lot moving and bustling. It's alive, this economy. These figures look sound and solid. There's a lot of hard work being done. And if I look at the innovation potential, it's quite amazing. I've got statistics that show me the different expenditure percentages of GDP for research and development, R&D. And if I take a country like Korea, which is also a tiger when it comes to innovation in Asia, I mean, Korea spends roughly the same in percent of GDP for R&D, but Israel doubles in output of innovative capacity relative to Korea. So you are, with the R&D spending, the most efficient innovators in my statistic. And that is why I tell you that I feel that you are the superpower of gray cells. And it's great you're there. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank you both, and I'm actually very proud, like a good Swiss institution, we finished right on time. So hopefully we prepare the ground for the next session panel. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We're about to begin the next session which is titled The Global Great Power Rivalry. Is the world out of order? Well, I think the answer for that question is rather clear-cut, yes, and you can, we're just waiting for them to set up the stage because we have a few more speakers to add. Mr. Matthews is graciously staying on, and we will pick up from where they left. I want to thank Yariv Nornberg and Janwillem Acket for a fascinating discussion on the future of the global economy. I think that was a great scene setter for what will follow now, because as we know, in this global age, in the 21st century, when we talk about great power politics or great power rivalry, we're talking a lot about economics, much more than we ever spoke before, and that's one of the questions that we will deal with. What does that exactly mean for this rivalry? How different will it be from rivalries that we knew in the 19th and 20th century. Let me count seats. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes, let's have the 8th seat added. And allow me to invite our speakers. Yes, especially if we'll start. Please, take the floor. Come on, up. We have with us, and as they join us, our Dean, Professor Boaz Ganol, Dr. Constanze Stelzenmüller, in the middle. Ladies are in the middle here. Ambassador Jean-David Levitte, General Rajiv Narayanan, the Honorable Christine Wormuth, Dr. Kenneth Weinstein, and last but not least, Benjamin Lim.
Thank you.
This is a very diverse group of individuals, and Mark Matthews is joining us, Head of Research for Julius Baer. From our right, Dr. Ken Weinstein, he's the President and CEO of the Hudson Institute. General Rajiv Narayanan is a retired general from the Indian Army who's now with the United Services Institute in India. Ambassador Jean-David Levitte is a retired French diplomat whose last position was diplomatic advisor to President Sarkozy and his personal Sherpa. Professor Boaz Ganol is the Dean of the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy at IDC, or in other words, my boss, one of them. Mr. Mark Matthews is the Head of Research Asia for Julius Baer. Dr. Constanze Stelzenmüller is with the Brookings Institute, where she is the Robert Bosch Fellow. The Honorable Christine Wormuth is now with RAND, but until recently served as the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Her successor actually will be joining us later this evening. And last but not least, Ben Lim is with the Straits Times. He's their global affairs correspondent. But previously, he was associated for many years with Reuters in Beijing and in Taipei. He actually headed the Beijing bureau for quite some time. So, without further delay, yes, I will try without further. Our discussion today is divided into two. We will be talking about what happened after the Osaka meeting. We'll build upon that to talk about the current situation and what will follow. And our second part of the discussion will talk about, we'll try to look a bit ahead into the future and talk about the emerging world order. And we have to stay on time, which is a critical element here. So without further ado, let's talk about what transpired in Osaka. And Mark, with your permission, I'll start because I want to pick up from your discussion and then take it to the geopolitical realm, if I may. If I'm understood correctly from the previous session, you're not so unsettled about the so-called trade war. It's paused now. Will it be resolved shortly? Do China and the United States on the trajectory towards partnership, cooperation, friendship?
I don't want to ramble, but I'll just say two things. The first I thought was most interesting was that the ban on Huawei was lifted. That's significant. That was very important to China. And the second is there's no deadline on when a deal must be done, unlike in Buenos Aires. So those are two positives that came out of it. But to reiterate what I said in the beginning, I feel, from my contacts in China that China will not do the things that the Americans want them to when it comes to particularly changing aspects of their own, internal rule set. I think they're willing to take some pain. By the way, I'll just tell you that what I heard from a largest toy manufacturer in China might be interesting to the ladies and gentlemen in the audience. If it is 25%, the way they're going to divvy that up is the toy manufacturer in China will pay 8%, and their U.S. counterpart will be it a Walmart or a Target, whatever, 8%, and then they'll raise the price for the consumer by 8%. So actually, China won't be hit by the full 25%.
So you're not so concerned, in other words?
Well, exports to the U.S. are about 3% of GDP in China. I don't think it's going to sink their ship.
But from a geopolitical perspective, is this US-China competition, which is the more popular term, really just a mild competition? This is only a trade dispute, or does it have more to it? Yeah, Christine.
I think it has much more to it. It's really a comprehensive competition, and there's an economic piece to it, which we've just spoken to. My own sense is China came away from Osaka pretty well. It's less clear from a U.S. perspective that things went in our direction. Well, there's a lot of concern, obviously, from a security perspective about Huawei, and you see that, I think, reflected in the comments of some senators, for example, like Marco Rubio, who are expressing concern with President Trump's change of position on Huawei, for example. But I think the competition has an economic dimension, it has a military dimension, but it also has a sort of a soft power dimension where really, I think when you boil it down, what the U.S. and China are competing for is the narrative about which country is going to be more attractive to more countries in the future.
All right. General.
Yeah, my reading about this is slightly different. It's not exactly only about trade. It's more to do with high-tech and innovation and future technologies.
Agree.
All right.
And it is a direct hit at Make in China 2025. Mm-hmm. It is for that. While the trade war, Huawei, all is there, but the main issue which the previous speakers had pointed out was about the arm twisting by the Chinese for the companies to share the technologies and give the technologies to the Chinese. It's to block that, and it's to block the high-tech and the future technologies, so that USA retains the leadership in this high technology.
Dr. Weinstein, you hosted Vice President Pence, what was it, in October, if I'm not mistaken, for what was considered a major China policy speech. In retrospect, we've, several months, and now with the meeting in Osaka, is there a changing course of the US policy vis-a-vis China? Or is this a tactical maneuver or some sort of slip-up, God forbid, or?
Yeah, look, there's two things going on. There's a deep strategic change in the United States, one that's across the political aisle, where there's universal agreement that China is a geostrategic threat to the United States over the long term, is a huge geostrategic threat in the region, that that there is a massive danger of mercantilist authoritarianism and these the China 2025 technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics, the next era in biotechnology, big data, all coming together, all being passed through Beijing or other places in China, and being to put together all sorts of information that anywhere else in the world would be a violation of privacy, that would make what's going on in Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs have been locked up, over 1 million people, look like a day at the beach. And that is the big long-term U.S. concern. Over the short term, the president, in my mind, he is playing a game with the Chinese to some degree. I don't think people in the administration expect a trade deal before the election, but the president's keeping an eye on the stock market. He is deeply concerned. He was spooked in December when the market dropped precipitously, and every time the market starts getting a little nervous about the direction of trade, he leans a little bit into the Chinese. But Ambassador Lighthizer, the trade rep, has been clear about what the Chinese need to do to come to an agreement, and the Chinese are nowhere near what they're doing.
Mr. Lim, as a China observer, for, I would say, decades. What is the perception in China about this image that Dr. Weinstein or Ken drew for us just now?
For China, I think it's the U.S. is a competitor, but it's also they also cooperate with the U.S. Right? I agree about the word using the word comprehensive. If you look at it on the political front, the U.S. preaches freedom and democracy. China has come up with a model that may replace that, and so they're rivals. On the diplomatic front, Kim Jong-un just had this summit with Trump, thanks to Xi Jinping, right? On the military front, the U.S. is decades ahead of China, right? On the cultural front, a lot of Chinese, they wear jeans, they eat hamburgers, they go to McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, they watch Hollywood movies, they listen to rock and roll. They love American culture, U.S. culture, American culture. But of course, if the trade war went on, then it could galvanize the nation. It's hard to quantify how many % of the people are apolitical, but there are a lot of people who are angry, who are afraid, and so but it's across the board. It's very, it's hard to say what will happen next, but right. But China needs the U.S. needs China, and so I think the two will have to cooperate and compete.
I understand. Where does this leave, first of all, Europe? Perhaps Jean-David and Constanze. Where does this leave Europe? Do they see what Ken Weinstein prescribed regarding China? Or are they more comfortable with the BRI, which the Belt and Road, which is supposed to connect China to Europe?
Well, I would say, in addition to what has been said so far, and I totally agree with what has been said, but there is an extra dimension which is, for me, a very great motive of preoccupation. It seems to me that we are at the beginning of the deconstruction of the world order as it was built at the end of the Second World War with the UN Charter and all these institutions based on the rule of law. And these are values which are coming from Europe, supported by America. America was the leader. And the world order now is being deconstructed, number one, by the leader, that is the United States, under the leadership of President Trump, because he considers that a good deal is not a win-win. It's the deal between a winner and a loser. And he prefers the law of the jungle, because in this jungle, the United States is the biggest lion. He doesn't see that there is another lion coming soon, and maybe bigger than the US lion, that is China. And your image of the Belt and Road initiative leads me to a parallel with the Roman Empire. During the days of the Roman Empire, the citizens used to say all the roads must lead to Rome. With the Belt and Road Initiative, all the roads must lead to Beijing. And if you go to Guinea, for instance, which is far away from China, well, it happens that it is being slowly transformed into a Chinese colony because they have the biggest stocks of bauxite, and China needs the bauxite. And they are slowly taking control of Guinea. That's an example of the road to Beijing.
Constanze?
Yeah. First off, I want to say thank you for having me here. It's nice to be in Herzliya again. And I also want to say there's nearly enough people on this stage to have a basketball game, only in Israel. But to your question, I think, let me give you an anecdote without naming names. Recently I had a visit from a senior advisor of a German head of, sorry, not a German, a European head of state, who said that he and his boss had been in the White House together at a meeting with the president, and he relayed a quote from the president, which was, "First we're coming for China, then we're coming for you." That I thought was a fairly strong quote. And I take the president at his words on these things. What I have an issue with, though, right now, with the point on with what is happening with China, is that I have to agree with Ken here that European concern regarding China's actions, whether it is the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it is industrial espionage, whether it is breaches of cybersecurity in Europe, have led European policymakers to conclude that China, like Russia, is now not just an active, but an aggressive and not rarely malignant actor in the European theater, not just in the rest of the world. And the difference between Russia and China in Europe is that the Russians are mostly destructive because the goal seems to be to show Russian citizens that we're just as bad as they are, we're dysfunctional, and so it doesn't matter that Russia is. The Chinese need the host animal to be functional because they need the European single market and they need the European space for their infrastructure projects. So the host animal needs to stay alive. But otherwise, I would say we have every reason to be concerned about Chinese activities in Europe. So I don't think that we are, this may be a hiatus, but we're not on the way to anything good. And if the Americans and the Europeans don't work together on this, we could have a very real problem in a very short time.
But let me follow up with one thing. Is there an appetite in Europe to work closely with the Americans?
Of course there is.
China?
Of course there is. It's just, it needs to be consistent. And what we're seeing right now is whipsawing. Yeah, one day this, one day that. It's, the same thing that Timur Pardo said yesterday about Iran. I've watched 2 weeks of this and I don't know what the policy is. We could say the same thing about US-China policy.
I completely agree. I was just going to two-finger to say that the smart move for the United States and Europe is to work together. Absolutely. Because, the Chinese panda, I'll say, instead of a tiger, is very large. But if the United States and the EU work together, we have a chance. Yeah.
Yes, quickly, because
Yes, one word. When President Macron visited President Trump in a state visit, he proposed precisely this alliance between EU and the US to impose on China the respect of the rules. And President Trump said, well, thank you very much, but I don't need you. I will take care by myself of China.
I understand.
Which is a mistake.
Just want to pause, because I want to ask also a question that is relevant for us for a moment.
Right.
When you look at this discussion about US, China, Europe, and it was even mentioned Russia here, what does this mean for Israel in this discussion?
Tommy, trying to jump in time and look in a retrospective point of view, say from 20 years from now backwards to the time that we are situated right now. What is really happening here? And what we see is a change of the system, of the international system, from a unipolar system into a multipolar system. And this multipolar system is based on, I believe, a triangle. And Europe would excuse me, it doesn't include in this triangle. This is United States, China, and Russia. And each one of those heads of the triangle has their economical goals and geopolitical goals. You're focusing on the economical side, and I would tell you, I believe that the coming months and years would change the economy because of the geopolitical military events, and not necessarily just because of the economical competition between China and United States or Russia or otherwise. Let me just focus on that for one moment. China has their impact on North Korea. Russia has their impact on what I call the axis of evil, which is Iran, Syria, Turkey, and the United States has Europe, has Israel, has Western countries, and maybe Sunni moderate countries altogether. I would ask, I would say that between those three elements in this new multipolar system, there is a zero-sum game. And whatever one party is winning, the other one is losing. And in my view right now, in a snapshot, the Americans are talking very high with big words, but they are losing the geopolitical game to the other two elements in this multipolar system.
Yeah, can I come in on the back of that?
Ladies first, but then I come back to you, of course.
Look, I agree with you on the point of American policy. I think that right now, simultaneous security brinksmanship on several continents, plus the weaponization of economic interdependence, are both working together to damage and undermine American power. And that's a problem for Europe. But I don't think that we are... I think that you are underestimating the degree to which trade and regulatory powers give Europe power in this game. I think the challenge of great power competition today is managing great power competition in a context of economic interdependence, and there Europe has a huge role to play.
General.
Yeah. As a person away from this, when you look at it, US was the sole dictating power when there was Cold War and after the Cold War over the complete world. It didn't have to fight many battles. It was one front at a time. Today it is fighting on 4 fronts, if you include the trade war also. He can't do it alone. They don't know how to use partnerships, how to build alliances and partnerships. They're learning. That is where I would agree that, yes, at the moment they are failing because they don't realize they can't do it alone. They have to go with the partners. Partners come with their own national interests. And there has to be compromises, which they're not ready to do at the moment.
Yeah, has the US lost it in terms of building partnerships and alliances?
I don't think so. Look, this is definitely an immensely complicated time.
I'm sorry for portraying you as the representative of the U.S. government.
That's fine. No, it's an immensely complicated time in global affairs, and the administration has a very ambitious agenda. And sometimes our ambitious agenda doesn't link up with our key allies and our key partners. Take, for example, Israel and the Israel-China relationship, which has become a real hot spot between the United States and Israel. Our government is not happy about the agreement to allow the container port of Haifa to be operated by a Chinese consortium, and we've sent very clear signals that this is it's going to be difficult for the U.S. Mediterranean fleet to visit in Haifa if that continues to be the case. There are great concerns about Chinese investments in certain Israeli technologies too that are highly sensitive. Similarly with India, I know that the Indian government's not thrilled with some of the developing world preferences that we've taken off of Indian trade, and particularly as this came up going into the Indian election. So these things are hard to manage, but we've built a very strong partnership, even with the Japanese in particular. As you look at the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, we've adopted a Japanese strategy that's really changed the face of how the U.S. looks at Asia, including the Indian Ocean as a key component, and including key alliances from Australia to partners like India, who are critical to the future of that region. And it's not a policy we developed in Washington, it was one that was developed in Tokyo.
I will come back to that in a second, but is China on the verge of taking an advantage now of building new partnerships, new coalitions, or it's not that's not in the Chinese playbook at this moment?
I think we fear China because we don't understand China enough, or it's either a lack of understanding or we don't understand China at all because it's still one of the most opaque countries in the world, right? But if you look at the nuances for China, a lot of things, it's not black or white. There are shades of gray, right? Take the trade war, for example. If it were extreme right, China would go down on its knees and sign a trade deal, right, and be accused of selling out or being a traitor, signing unequal treaties, just like the Opium War, the Shimonoseki, 1895, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, the other political extreme would be China would wage all-out war against the U.S. by, for example, refusing to sell rare earth, dumping T-bills, or going to other extremes. But China doesn't overreact. It doesn't swing to either political extreme these days, rarely. So it's more nuanced.
Mark, as an economist, are you more concerned from what you hear now from the defense, foreign policy experts than you were when we started?
Yes. I'm not sure what I can add to that. But just listening to my colleagues here on the panel, it's clear that there's a lot of concern about China on the world stage, and therefore what appears to be a more cohesive effort to I don't want to say contain China, but to make sure that it it doesn't continue the very aggressive expansion that it's clearly been doing. It started well over 10 years ago with the commodity supercycle in Asia and in Africa and South America. Now it's become much more technology oriented. But I don't know if Trump was the catalyst. To me, the genie's out of the bottle. Just listening to my colleagues here on the panel, it's not going to be put back in.
All right. Yes.
No, what I fear is the deconstruction of the global economy with the value chain which exists today, transformed into two antagonistic poles, one based on the US economy and the other one on the Chinese economy. And we see it right now, and it may lead to disastrous consequences.
You mentioned now what is also known as the decoupling.
Yes.
We will come back to that definitely, because that's a major issue for the next step. But before that, India for a moment. There has been also, in light of the problematic relations or problematic issues between India and the United States, we can also notice some sort of Chinese and Russian overtures towards India. Is this something that is working, or?
No, what the US can offer, I don't think either the Chinese or the Russians can offer. Russia has nothing much to offer other than weapons, gas, and maybe IT. He never uses us. So it's just weapons and gas. But
that's not
that's
things,
it.
That's it, yes.
That's it. But there's much more you gain from the West. I wouldn't say just the Americans, from the West to gain, as far as India sees it. As far as Chinese, no way. When they come in like a parasite and eat up your economy. Then you're totally dependent on their economy. Like, I'll give you an example, if you give me the time, a small example.
Yes,
it was the high-speed railway lines. Yes. Both Japan and Chinese were offered the contracts on two different lines. The Japanese took it on our conditions, that certain sharing of technology, and they wanted a high-speed train to be built, the bullet train. We said, okay, but sharing of technology. The Chinese till date have refused to share anything. And they say that everything the rail will come from China. Why would I do it? India is not a fool. So we have left it at that and say, okay, you're welcome whenever you come to our terms. You will get the same terms in the manner in which we do with the rest of the world. That's the problem.
Yes.
It's worth remembering, I think, that actually the deepening of the U.S.-India relationship started under the previous administration and actually has been a point of continuity going into the Trump administration. And I would argue part of what has facilitated bringing that relationship together is a mutual concern about China and its activities.
All right. Let's stop for a moment in Europe and also its relations with Russia for a moment, because we didn't mention that too much. Sure. And I want to build also up on what the chairwoman of the CDU said this morning about, well, she was referring to Germany. It's time that Germany takes on more responsibility in terms of security and defense, but she was also referring to Europe at large. Mm. Is that something we are about to see? Can we anticipate a more European resolve, a return to world stage, a more tougher stance on Russia? Constanze?
Sure. Maybe if I may, I'll start. Look, I'm not going to pretend to you or anybody in the audience that Europe currently presents a unified a facade to the exterior. The opposite is true. We're profoundly divided on a broad spectrum of issues, and we have real problems of domestic cohesion, degradation of our representative democratic institutions, and so on. I am not going to deny any of that, and I think, and to me, that's as a German and a European, that's a profound concern. I will, however, say that I have seen a genuine develop. This is the good news part of the answer. I think a Europe and European policymakers who are ever more conscious of the degree to which Europe has again become a battleground of great powers. And frankly, those of us who think about this know that if we're not at the table, we're on the menu.
Yes, if I may, let's have a look back in history. First, it's the first time in the world history that a group of states are trying to unite their destinies not with battles, with military might, but through democratic dialogue. It never existed elsewhere in the past, and it doesn't exist elsewhere today. So it's difficult. Number two, please keep in mind that only 3 decades ago, half of our members were, not half, but 1/3, were part of the Soviet Empire. The Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic, and so on and so forth. For me, born just after the Second World War, we called the Germans les Bosch. Now they are our best friends. Look at the Poles. And the same is true from the Germans. So it is a unique success. And I think we should keep this in mind because it's very important. Yes, we are absorbed by the construction of our future, our common future, but we have absorbed also 15 newcomers coming from the other side of the Iron Curtain. And I think that we should keep this in mind before we condemn the importance, supposed importance, of the EU today.
Yeah, I would like to reinforce what Jean-David just said. I think what people tend to underestimate in the US, maybe also here, is that while we always look like a bickering big family, the cohesive strength of the EU is actually quite extraordinary. And I'm a lawyer by training. What people miss is, or a lot of people misread the EU as a kind of a, you know, an alliance on the cheap, where you can check in and check out and ask for your dues back. This is just factually incorrect. We have a really deep community, not just of laws and rules, but also of customs, of convictions. The open borders have had a real effect. Most European students who are of the age of our children, the next generation, have studied in 3 different European countries. This has genuinely produced a European public opinion, and you saw that in the European elections with a turnout of historic proportions, well over 50%, which is really unusual.
Boss, I'm coming back to a point that Constanze mentioned, and which is, if you're not at the table, you might be at the menu. And this issue with vis-a-vis the United States and China and Russia, are we at the table or are we closer to becoming part of the menu?
Define we.
Israel.
Israel. Well, I think that Israel right now put all the chips on the American administration and not on the European relationships. I think, you know, we have esteemed colleagues here coming from Europe. They see it differently from the way we see it from Israel. But from Israel, it seems that Europe is having a lot of problems right now. Having a lot of problems. You're talking about the unification of Europe, and I'm looking on the Schengen Agreement, and I see the problems that they have in reference to the Schengen Agreement. And suddenly, when you travel in Europe, you have border controls that you didn't see before, and so on and so forth. I think that the way I see it, their standing, their global standing, and their influence that used to be much stronger, even here in the Middle East, is eroding as well. So I do believe, as I said before, that the only way to strengthen the liberal democratic axis, led by United States, is by having much stronger alliances between Europe and United States and Israel and maybe a few Arab Sunni countries which are now leaning towards more...
But is that wishful thinking or realistic possibility?
Look, since you can see in a very clear eye the growing threat to this axis in the Middle East, in Europe, and worldwide, there is no other way but achieving that. It will come sooner or later. So I don't know if it's optimistic or pessimistic by saying that I'm quite sure that we would see this axis becoming stronger.
So it will have to get much worse or a bit more worse before it gets a bit better.
Yes.
I wrap that up. I want to move on, with your permission, and talk about the longer... I'm pressing the right button, but it's not apparently working. I want to talk about a bit into the future, and I want to start with the observation that Janwillem just made a few moments ago about the possible decoupling. And I want to ask a basic question, because we deal in political science, but somebody would help us economic perspective. Is this economic iron curtain a realistic scenario? Can that really happen, Mark? Can we see a decoupling?
The short answer is yes. In the first panel, I mentioned how last year the Chinese were very afraid of what was going on. And just to use a small vignette of that, briefly, one of their very large companies called ZTE, if you use the American pronunciation, was embargo put on it by the United States government. It didn't last long, but it would have effectively put the company out of business. And that really scared the Chinese, and it made them think we need to be more humble, we need to be more submissive to the Americans. And I don't know why, but I can tell you that Huawei provoked exactly the opposite reaction. It didn't make them afraid, it didn't make them submissive, humble. The contrary, it made them think we have to really do it on our own. And so the more, I think this is something that just I thought of when you asked the question, but the more these attempts are made to bring China into line, for lack of a better word, the more it may choose to just go its own way and develop its own parallel system.
So what explains this change?
No, I think Huawei went its own way after the U.S. slapped sanctions, right? But after the arrest of the daughter of the Huawei chairman, Mr. Ren, the chairman of Huawei, was, I think, pretty reserved in his remarks. And he said he has faith in the U.S., in the Canadian system, in the U.S. systems, that his daughter would be acquitted instead of, being belligerent and trigger happy. So I think the timing of that, when Huawei decided to go its own way, was after the sanctions were slapped or announced.
So do we see a new approach on the Chinese way of dealing with the United States, with the West, with the international economy now? Do we see that change, or?
I'll tell you, for me, I'd encourage everybody who is interested in the subject to watch Xi Jinping's speech that he made in the Belt Road Initiative Forum in Beijing, which I think was about, I want to say a month and a half or 2 months ago. It's a long speech. I think it's about 40 minutes long, but you can watch it on YouTube. I urge you to do it. So then you really understand their perspective. And let's face it, he's running the country, and thanks to Donald Trump, he's stronger than ever. And I think that they're very intent, actually, on building their own parallel system and having a certain number of countries that are willing to be part of it. And so I think this is the new trajectory.
So we are on the path of decoupling, in other words?
I personally think so, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, the decoupling would take place, because if you look at the way the Chinese are doing it, they reckon...
Will take place, you mean?
The decoupling of the two world economies will happen. Chinese are not going to change tack, because the way they are pursuing their economic policies, which is very much part of the BRI strategy, is part of the constitution. And he is on record to have told not once but twice in the 19th Congress and the 13th NPC that the BRI is the road to Chinese rejuvenation. So I do not see Chinese changing tack.
Where does that leave the United States? Because it has economic implications, but what are the political implications for US leadership of the world?
Well, again, I mean, we certainly didn't help ourselves, in my view, in voluntarily walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been, that was an opportunity for the United States to work with all of the other countries to write rules that it would have been a part of instead of being on the outside looking in. I think we need to be working, again, with our European allies, with allies in Asia, with friends in Asia, to be working together to have a strategy to address the Belt and Road Initiative. We can't just let it happen all by itself.
Ken, do you think that the United States, in face of the decoupling, will start cooperating more, working more closer with potential allies, or?
Absolutely. Through the Build Act, which Congress passed, we're attempting to restructure our foreign aid programs and encourage much greater foreign investment in these countries. But let me note that the decoupling was part of the Belt and Road strategy already. It's like two different systems. You can either be on Android or you can be on Apple. And that's the choice the Chinese wanted to present to developing countries, whether it comes to rail gauges, whether it comes to cell phone systems, 5G technologies, underwater cables. And that massive subsidies, but you give up control of your information if that's what you want, and some people have bought into it. Fortunately, countries, thanks to efforts by the United States and other governments, are now aware of the ransom that they're being, that they have to pay with Belt and Road projects, and people are showing greater skepticism about these projects around the world. The Japanese are stepping up with significant amounts of foreign aid and new aid programs that will have a big impact, and there's also a huge amount of investment flows out of China from foreign companies that had been in China for investing in Vietnam, investing in Thailand and other places in Southeast Asia where they know that their intellectual property is not going to be compromised and they know their products won't essentially be stolen out of their hands. And this is going to have a bigger impact on China over the long term.
Yeah, what I was saying was that the alternate narrative to the BRI is already working. It's a work in progress. The Build Act, the Asia-Africa corridor of India and Japan, the success story is Tanzania just recently cancelled the Bagamoyo port when they realized that it's a white elephant. So it's going on.
And on top of this decoupling in the world economy, what we see is a weakening of the international organizations which are supposed to help us to work together. And that's the result of President Trump's policy. We had weakened WTO, for instance, and he puts in danger the appellate body because he doesn't want to appoint the new judges. And so if we don't have an arbiter accepted by everybody, all states, we are going to have a law of a jungle. That's my fear.
Yes.
I'd like to come in here with 2 points. I'll make them as crisply as I can. One, decoupling. I think that the American huge internal market and possession of strategic resources leads America to think, mistakenly, that it can fully uncouple itself. I think that the economists in trade, USTR, and elsewhere have failed to consider the huge disruptive costs of that, social and political, and the decisions on ZTE or ZTE and on Huawei, why have they been made? Because tariffs translate into costs. They are taxes on US consumers, and those mean votes. That's why they were attracted. On Professor Gano, if I may add my second point, I beg to disagree with you. I think that your tripolar framing is too narrow because it considers only military power. The truth is that the American and the European economies are deeply economically interdependent, which means that not only are we your natural allies, America has first-order American strategic interests in Europe, which, if it harms the EU, which this administration is deeply hostile to, it is engaging in an act of self-harm. And given the deep interests of Israel in the European economy and in the European market, you shouldn't want to let that happen, frankly. You have an interest in it not happening.
That's more than welcome. But I have a question. Who, and this might be very simplistic, and you might actually not be very happy with this question, but I'll ask it anyway. In your economic assessment, who would fare better in terms of decoupling, China or the United States?
Who will, excuse me, who will what better?
Who would
Fare better? Without a doubt, the United States. I think the China, I just mentioned before, the population problem that China's facing. If they do get isolated from the rest of the world in terms of their ability to use and acquire technology, that's a major hindrance. But I think, I'll keep it very simply, I think it comes back to soft power, and most people, given the choice, would prefer to be in the U.S. camp simply because, for all its faults, it's a democracy, and it's a pretty nice place. And I think, most people, if they could choose between the two, would rather be part of the so-called free world. There will be a few countries that'll go for the money, and they could have a high-speed train now between Nairobi and Mombasa. That's wonderful, for example. So that's been great for the Kenyans, and I think there's probably a few countries in Asia that will go on the Chinese side, but I think most will remain on the side of the United States.
So, from an economic perspective, we may have lost the liberal world order, but it's not definitely going to be a China century.
We haven't lost the liberal world order. Come on.
You haven't?
No.
Or we'll come back. But is it going to be replaced by a China century?
I personally don't think so.
All right.
No, and we haven't lost the liberal world order. Jesus. Sorry, but I'm a Lutheran. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here, shall we? Yes, representative democracy, rules-based international order is in trouble. Why is it in trouble? Because we assumed, I think, throughout the post-war period, and particularly after 1989, all of us in the West misinterpreted the 1989 egregiously as we won, we never have to invest in our democracies again, because this runs itself, it's self-repairing. No, this is actually untrue. The globalization, the deepening of economic integration, the mobility of people, data, ideas, and goods has a hugely stressful impact on the function on nation states. And if we want to be able to live in this integrated order and in deepening economic integration, we have to make sure that our nation states function. And that is where we have failed to invest, and we need to do that now. Otherwise, we will see a further rise and surge of the populists and the authoritarians.
But isn't, from an American perspective at least now, all these wonderful values that Constanze just mentioned, aren't they gone from, let me put it this way, they're not at the top priority of the U.S. administration?
Look, they're not a priority for the president, but they're definitely a priority for the administration. Just as and the WTO reform, we have different ideas of what has to be done. Let me get 2 seconds on that. We believe that the appellate body is acting almost like a legislature, deciding things, deciding precedent. That's what 4 American presidents have complained about the WTO, have pushed for reform. Trump is holding the line on it and is demanding that changes be made, but it's not totally out of line with what came before him. The difference now is the Chinese model is a model in which the government protects itself from the people. That's the difference between the two systems, period. And China is trying to export this model. They're trying to export this model to Saudi Arabia. They're trying to export this model to all sorts of governments around the world. Where you take the heights of high technology, you combine that with facial recognition software, all sorts of new weaponry, a social control system. That's the battle. Our government's well aware of that, speaks about it, And that's the real concern, and that's what the challenge is going to be. It's going to be us against, with the EU, and it increasingly is aware of this, recognizes the challenge that this new model poses to itself and to others.
All right. Yes.
I do have to say, I find it worrying that hearing you say, Ken, that it's a priority for the administration, even if it's not a priority for the president. It's a problem, I think, when the president isn't standing up for the kinds of things that Constanze was talking about. And I think it's a problem, even if he's not actively articulating it, when he's passively silent on the matter, it raises questions in people's minds, in our allies' minds, in our friends' minds. And I think that's a real challenge that we have right now is we may be pursuing policies in many places that are ones that we're very comfortable with, but the president himself doesn't seem to be behind them, and that's a problem. I also just wanted to say I agree with Constanze 100%. The liberal world order is not dead, but we do have to adapt it. We need to reinvent it. We can't just go back to how we were. We've got to modernize the house.
I understand. Jean-David Levitte and then Bosch.
Yes, I think I should add one extra reflection idea to this discussion. That is, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the unification of the world, we had the idea, which is now an illusion, that the unification of the world would lead to the spread of democratic values. And now, after 9/11 and the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan and the financial crisis, we see that these emerging giants they say yes to modernization, they say yes to globalization, they say no to westernization. And it's very important. Look at Putin. He wants to rebuild the empire of Catherine the Great. Look at Erdogan. He wants to rebuild the Ottoman Empire. Look at Modi in India. He based his vision on the values of traditional India. And it's even more true with Xi Jinping. So we have a kind of explosion, and we have lost our illusion about the westernization of the world. This is another very important dimension of what is happening now.
So you, just to sum up and make sure that I got it, you're not so confident that the liberal international order will be back?
Exactly.
All right. Boss?
Well, thank God I'm not the only pessimistic person on here right now. And I would say...
Israeli, so you're expected.
I think we're mixing between two terms, between the democratic values and liberal values, and they are not the same. And I would agree that I don't see right now a real change in the global order in reference to the democratic values. Democracies are as strong as they used to be. But the problem is that they become much more populist. And what we are losing is the liberal element, the liberal values, which should be accompanied with the democracies. And we see the rise of populist leaders, and it's not just in the United States, it's also the strengthening of extreme right in Europe. I don't want to speak about Israel on that term, and other places altogether. Yeah, many of those populists actually paint themselves as the big Democrats. Mentioning Erdogan, if you would ask, Erdogan is definitely the protector of democracy. But the problem is they're misusing the democratic values for those purposes.
Yes, and I also want to direct a question, if I may, and I'll come back to the general in a second.
I think China...
I want to add on a question. If I listened to what the Westerners had to say, China is not in a good position in the long run, either in terms of the decoupling or of maintaining some position vis-a-vis the world order. Is China, but this assumes that China will not do anything about it. What is China likely, or how will it respond to these challenges?
China is It's where it is today, thanks to, in part, to the U.S. Nixon came and knocked on China's doors in 1972. 7 years later, the two countries established diplomatic relations, and China started this policy of reform and opening up, right? It opened up to the outside world. It started economic reforms, and it's only been 40 years, right? It's been implementing economic reforms for 40 years, but it is where it is today, thanks in part to the U.S. Now, if you decide to contain China, then of course what would happen next, I think, would be decoupling. China is far from perfect. China has a lot on its plate. It has a lot of problems, but I think engagement plus competition is better than containment, right? The Chinese, before the G20, right? The Chinese, they were convinced that the U.S. was not just, that the trade war was not just about the trade war. The Chinese leadership was convinced that it was going to be 3 Ds. The first D is demonize China. Second D, democratize China. Third D, dismember China.
Dismember.
Because that was what happened to the Soviet Union. Back then, the US was number 1, the Soviet Union was number 2, China was number 3. And Nixon came and knocked on China's doors, teamed up with what the Chinese say was their secondary enemy against their primary enemy, the USSR, right? I think engagement is still better than containment.
General Narayanan, you want to add it?
Just taking on from what he had said, like what India follows from ancient scriptures is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It's a Sanskrit phrase that the world is one.
World is why?
World is one.
What?
Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is very different from the empire building versions of history of Putin or Erdogan, which is very different. That's what.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming up very near to wrapping up, and if we actually give back a minute to the conference, I think it will be widely appreciated. But there is something that is still bothering me in the short term, and this comes to where Israel, what should Israel do now in face of this discussion? Do we understand that we have a vested interest in closer relations with Europe? Do we have an understanding that we have a problem in our relations with China? Boaz.
Well, I don't think that we have a problem with the relation with China. What we have is a contradiction between the relations that could have been with China in reference to our main ally, which is United States. They would not permit that, maybe rightly so from their point of view. We see a strengthened relationship between Israel and Russia that was unparalleled to what used to be in the past. And in reference to Europe, I'm quite optimistic. I believe that we are sharing the same values, we are sharing the same interests, and I do believe that the relations between Israel and the EU will be even stronger than today.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in applauding this panel of seasoned expert practitioners for what I hope was a fascinating discussion. And thank you all. And we will start in a moment in the next session on US-Israel relations. To that end, I want to invite General Amos Gilad in a moment to join us.